I have kept very few secrets in my life, not because I lack the discipline for it. 40 years running an engineering consulting firm teaches you exactly how to hold information close when it matters. I kept secrets when they needed keeping. But by nature, by temperament, I am not a man who enjoys walking around with something unspoken sitting behind his ribs. Which is why the evening I am about to tell you about sat differently with me than almost anything else in 60 years of living. Because for one dinner, at one table, in one house in Buckhead, Georgia, I understood every single word being said around me, and not one other person at that table knew it. Not my wife, Eleanor, seated to my left. Not my daughter, Sophie, seated across from me, laughing at something her fiancé had just said, her face open in the particular way a person's face is open when they believe, fully and without question, that they are safe. And certainly not the two women 3 seats down, leaning toward each other with wine glasses in hand, speaking in low, comfortable tones about my daughter, about my family, with the complete and total confidence that comes from believing no one at the table could possibly understand what they were saying. They were wrong. I understood every word. And I want to tell you, before anything else, that what I did with that understanding is not the part of this story I am proudest of because it was clever. I've been clever before. Clever is easy. I am proud of it because it was precise, because it was quiet, because it did not require me to raise my voice, overturn a table, or become a man my daughter would have to apologize for later. It required something else entirely. It required me to sit very still, hold what I knew for exactly as long as it needed to be held, and then choose, deliberately, carefully, the exact right moment to let them discover that the room they thought was private had never been private at all. My name is Robert William Thatcher. I am 60 years old. I have one daughter, and she is the reason for everything I am about to tell you. But before I tell you what was said that night, I need you to understand something about how a secret like mine gets built in the first place. Because it didn't start at that dinner table. It started decades earlier, in a kitchen in a small house outside Atlanta, with a woman who believed, with a conviction that never once wavered in the 50-some years I knew her. That language was not a hobby. It was a form of protection. Her name was Marielle. She was my mother. And everything that happened at that dinner table traces back to a decision she made in 1971, before I was even born, when she stepped off a plane in Georgia with a suitcase, $40, and a language that no one around her spoke. She was determined that her children would never be caught the way she had been caught, unable to fully understand the room they were standing in. She succeeded. By the time I was 12 years old, I moved between English and French without thinking about the movement at all. It had become invisible to me. The way you stop noticing your breathing. I want to be honest with you. For most of my life, this was simply a fact about me, a pleasant inheritance. Something that came up at dinner parties, on trips abroad, in the occasional overheard exchange on a train or in a hotel lobby. Small moments where understanding a language other people assumed was private gave me a piece of information I wasn't meant to have. It had never once mattered. It had never once been about my daughter. Until a Saturday evening in September, at a beautifully set table in a beautifully maintained house, where 2 women I had known for exactly 6 months sat 3 feet away from me and began, very quietly, in a language they were certain I did not speak, to say things about Sophie, about our family, that they would never, ever have said if they had known I understood. I picked up my wine glass. I smiled the way you smile when you are listening to pleasant background music. And I began, without a single change in my expression, to listen. What I heard over the next 30 minutes is not something I will forget for the rest of my life. Neither will they. Before I tell you about that table, I need you to know who was sitting across from it, because Sophie is not incidental to this story. Sophie is the entire reason it exists. Eleanor and I married in 1988. Sophie arrived in 1996, our only child, and if I am honest, our only real project as a married couple. Everything else in our life organized itself around her without either of us ever discussing that it should. She was the kind of child who asked why before she asked what. 6 years old, she reorganized her entire bedroom on her own initiative, then came downstairs to explain her system to us with the seriousness of someone presenting quarterly results. Eleanor and I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the whole thing. The system, for the record, was excellent. She grew into a woman who matched that child precisely. A research biochemist now, working out of a university in Atlanta, published in 3 peer-reviewed journals before she turned 30. Rigorous. Warm. Possessed of a laugh that I have privately considered, for 28 years, the best sound in any room it happens to occupy. She met Julian Beaumont at an academic conference in Boston back in 2021. Julian was a software engineer, thoughtful and soft-spoken, from a French-Canadian family that had settled in Georgia in the early 1990s. His parents, Henri and Colette, had built a commercial real estate business in Buckhead over 3 decades. Successful, well-regarded, the kind of quiet local wealth that doesn't need to announce itself. I want to say clearly, before anything else, I liked Julian immediately. There was nothing performed about the way he looked at my daughter. A father notices that. A father catalogs it carefully, and I catalogued it, and what I found satisfied me completely. Julian was never the problem in this story. His family was where things got complicated, though it took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand exactly how. We met the Beaumonts properly for the first time about 6 months before the engagement dinner at a smaller gathering at their home. Henri answered the door himself. A big, warm man, the kind whose handshake tells you something true about him before he said a word. He had the particular musicality in his English of someone whose first language lived somewhere else, just beneath the surface. I liked him instantly and never had reason to reconsider it. Colette met us in the living room a few minutes later. She was elegant in the specific way of a woman who has spent 30 years as the organizing intelligence of a household and has grown entirely comfortable with the quiet authority that comes with it. She embraced Eleanor warmly. She embraced Sophie warmly. She shook my hand. I noticed, the way you notice small temperature changes in a room, that her smile reached her eyes for Eleanor and Sophie and reached somewhat less far for me. I didn't think much of it that first evening. People have off days. People run out of warmth by the third guest sometimes, and I happened to be the third guest. But it happened again at the next gathering. And the one after that. Small things. Nothing you could point to. The way she'd ask Sophie detailed questions about her research and then ask me only whether traffic had been bad on the way over. The way she'd compliment Eleanor's dress and simply nod at mine. The way, once, she referred to our lovely little family to another guest in a tone I couldn't quite place. Pleasant on the surface, with something underneath it I didn't have a name for yet. I filed it away. I am a man who files things away. It is, I found, one of the more useful habits a person can develop. By the time the engagement was announced and Colette began planning the celebration dinner, I had 6 months of small, accumulated observations sitting quietly in the back of my mind. Nothing conclusive, nothing I could have described to Eleanor without sounding paranoid, but enough that when the invitation came for a Saturday evening in September, I walked into that house with my attention already, turned up slightly higher than usual. I did not know yet what I would hear. I only knew, somehow, that I should be listening. The Beaumont house in September looked exactly like what it was. A home decorated by someone with genuine taste and the means to fully act on it. Colette had set the table with the kind of precision that isn't really about the table at all. It's a statement, a quiet demonstration of standards. Henri met us at the door with his usual warmth. Colette embraced Eleanor and Sophie in the living room and gave me the handshake I had come to expect. Marguerite, Colette's younger sister, visiting from Montreal for the occasion, arrived a few minutes after us. 57, elegant, carrying herself like a woman attending an audit rather than a celebration. She was warm to Sophie in a way I watched carefully and privately suspected was slightly performed. She was pleasant to Eleanor. She gave me a nod that had already reached a conclusion about who I was. We sat down at 7. For the first half hour, everything was exactly what you'd expect from an engagement dinner. Henri told a long story about a property deal that had nearly fallen through. Eleanor asked Colette about the flowers, which led to a 10-minute discussion of a florist in Buckhead who was apparently very difficult to book. Sophie and Julian were quiet and happy in the way new couples are, occasionally exchanging a look across the table that had Colette and Marguerite drifted into French a few times throughout. Nothing unusual. 2 sisters, first language French, falling back into the comfort of it the way people do. A comment about Marguerite's flight. A cousin's news. A property Henri was considering. I understood every word, the same way I always do. I responded normally to the English. I let the French pass by like background music, the way I've done 100 times in 100 rooms without it ever meaning anything. I want to be honest about something. For those first 30 minutes, I wasn't listening for anything. I had my guard up out of habit, not suspicion. I was simply having dinner with my family. Then the second bottle of wine came out, and Colette leaned slightly toward Marguerite, the particular lean of someone who has been holding something in and has finally decided the moment has arrived to let it out. She said, in French, quietly, "She's pretty enough." Not what I pictured for Julian, if I'm honest. Marguerite, what did you picture? Colette, something with more weight behind it. Her father's an engineer, isn't he? Marguerite glanced my way, then back. He seems nice enough. A little plain. I kept my expression exactly where it was. I want you to understand what that costs, in the moment. Holding a face still while something like that lands. It is not nothing. I told myself, wait. Let it be one comment. People say careless things at dinner tables sometimes, and it means less than it sounds like it means. Colette continued, "The girl's bright. I'll give her that. But the family is very ordinary, very American. Marguerite, does Julian know what he's marrying into?" And Colette, with a small, precise smile, the kind that tells you she said something like this before, about other people, in other rooms. He's in love. He doesn't know anything yet. I sat with my wine glass halfway to my mouth. Here is what I want to tell you honestly about that moment, because I think it matters more than the clever part that came later. For about 10 seconds, I didn't know what I was going to do. Not because I was angry, though I was. Because I genuinely didn't know yet whether the right thing was to say nothing at all, to let it go. To decide that a comment made in a private language, believed to be unheard, causes no real harm if it's never discovered. Sophie was happy. Julian loved her. Maybe the kindest thing, the most fatherly thing, was to simply let this die quietly in a language no one at the table would ever know I understood. I looked at Sophie. She was laughing at something Julian had whispered to her, her face completely open, completely unguarded, in the particular way a person's face is open when they believe without question that the room around them is safe. And that was the thing that decided it for me, not the insult itself. I could have absorbed that on my own account and moved on. It was watching my daughter sit there, safe and happy, 3 feet away from 2 people who had just decided, out loud, in a language they thought was private, that she wasn't good enough for their son. I put my wine glass down. I looked at the tablecloth for exactly 3 seconds, and I made a decision, not about whether to respond, because that part was already settled. The decision I made was about how. Because there is a version of this evening where I stand up, switch to French, and make Colette Beaumont deeply and publicly uncomfortable at her own table, in front of her husband and her sister and her son. I could have done that. Some part of me, in that moment, badly wanted to. But I thought of my mother. I thought about the 53 years since she taught me my first French word at her kitchen table, and everything she'd told me, many times, in many contexts, about what the language was actually for. Not for winning, not for humiliating, for the things that matter. So I picked my wine glass back up. I let the conversation drift onto wedding plans, and I waited for the right moment to let the Beaumont family discover, calmly and completely on my terms, that the room they thought was private had never been private at all. Dessert came and went. Colette had shifted the conversation to the wedding, describing, in English now, a property outside Lyon that had hosted several family weddings, presenting it with the warmth of a woman who has already decided something and is calling it a suggestion. I let her finish. I complimented the idea. I meant it, actually. It did sound beautiful. Then I mentioned, almost in passing, that my mother had been from Lyon. Henri lit up immediately, delighted, the way people do when they discover an unexpected thread connecting them to someone. He asked if I knew any French. "A little," I said. I let the evening continue on its ordinary course after that. No scene. No moment. I wanted Colette to relax fully back into the belief that her private language was still private, because I intended to have this conversation on my terms, in my own time. Not at a table full of people, not in front of Julian, not in a way that would leave Sophie's engagement dinner remembered as the night her father humiliated his future in-laws in front of everyone. My chance came about 20 minutes later, as the evening loosened into its final stretch. Coffee being cleared, jackets being found, the particular unhurried shuffle of a dinner party winding down. Henri walked me out toward the front hall to get my coat. Colette followed a moment later to say her goodbyes. Marguerite just behind her. I said, quietly, in French, to all 3 of them at once. Not loud, not performed, just direct. Before we go, I want to mention something. I understood everything you said at the table tonight. About Sophie. About our family being ordinary. About Julian not knowing what he's getting into. Silence. Henry's face changed first. Confusion, then something sharper. Colette recovered fast. I don't know what you think you heard. I heard all of it, I said. Still in French, still even. Word for word. My mother was from Lyon. I've spoken French since I was 7. You're mistaken, Marguerite said. We were talking about the property. I let that sit for a moment. I want to be honest. Some part of me expected this. Nobody likes being caught, and the first instinct of most people, when they're caught, is to insist they weren't. Marguerite, I said, you said he seems nice enough, a little plain. Colette, you said the family is very ordinary, very American. You said Julian doesn't know what he's getting into. I paused. I can keep going, if it would help. Colette went quiet. Henri looked at his wife. I watched something pass over his face that I understood immediately, because I felt it myself. The particular disappointment of realizing someone you love has shown you a side of themselves you didn't want confirmed. Colette, he said. Just her name. It carried more than a sentence would have. I said, still evenly. I'm not telling you this to embarrass anyone. I could have said something at the table in front of everyone, and some part of me wanted to. I didn't, because that's not who I am, and it's not what tonight was supposed to be about. But I wasn't going to let it go unsaid, either. Colette's composure. The thing I'd watched her hold for 6 months, the organizing authority she carried into every room, slipped, just slightly. I don't expect you to understand my perspective, she said. I've spent 30 years thinking carefully about who Julian. I understand it perfectly, I said. You've decided my daughter isn't enough. I'd just like you to have complete information before you finish deciding that. I reached into my jacket and took out a card. I'd nearly not brought it. Eleanor had asked, half joking, why I was carrying it to a dinner party, and I hadn't entirely had an answer for her at the time. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me knew this evening might call for it. It was a card from the Thatcher Foundation, the organization Eleanor and I started in 2018 after I sold my consulting firm. STEM scholarships for underserved kids across Georgia. 240 grants awarded so far. Robert William Thatcher, founder and chairman, printed in plain type beneath the name. I handed it to Henri, not Colette. He read it, read it again, looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as recalculating. You said you were an engineer, he said. I am, I said. I was also, apparently, plain. Nobody laughed. It wasn't a moment for laughing, but something in Henry's face eased slightly, the way a person's face eases when a piece of information rearranges something they'd assumed. Colette looked at the card in her husband's hand. She didn't ask to see it. I noticed that. Henri said, quietly, I owe you an apology. Both of you, he added, glancing at Colette and Marguerite. Owe one. In my house, at my table. This isn't who we are supposed to be. Colette said nothing for a long moment. Then, stiffly, to me, I spoke carelessly. I didn't mean for it to be heard. I know you didn't, I said. That was rather the point of saying it in French. She didn't have a response to that. I said, Julian loves my daughter well. That's what matters here. The rest is time and better information. You have some of that now. I put my coat on. Eleanor and Sophie came into the hall a moment later, entirely unaware, already saying their goodbyes, already thanking Colette for a lovely evening. I said nothing to Sophie in that doorway. That conversation was going to happen, just not there. Eleanor and I drove home in the kind of silence two people fall into after 36 years of marriage. A silence that isn't empty, just full of things that don't need saying yet. About 10 minutes in, she said, you went quiet in that hallway. What happened? I told her. All of it. The French at the table, what Colette and Marguerite had said, what I'd said back to them at the door, the card. Eleanor didn't say anything for a while. Then, Sophie doesn't know any of this. No, I said. Are you going to tell her? I thought about it for longer than the question probably deserved. I want to be honest about something. I wasn't fully certain, even after everything, that telling her was the right call. There's a version of fatherhood that protects by staying quiet, and a version that protects by being honest. And I've never been entirely sure which one serves a person better in a moment like this. Not the exact words, I finally said. She doesn't need to carry those around, but enough that she knows. Enough that if Colette's warmth toward her ever feels thin in a room, she understands why, and she knows she didn't imagine it. Eleanor was quiet again. Then, your mother would have known exactly how much to say. She taught me that much, at least, I said. I'm hoping it's enough. I didn't sleep especially well that night. I kept turning the evening over, wondering if I'd handled it the way I told myself I had, calmly, precisely, or whether I'd simply found a controlled way to do something that was, underneath it, still about my own pride. Fathers like to believe they act purely on behalf of their children. It's not always entirely true. I lay awake long enough to genuinely question it. By morning, I still didn't have a fully clean answer. But I knew I owed Sophie the conversation regardless of how I felt about my own motives. She came for coffee on Sunday, same as she had most Sundays since she was in college. We sat in the kitchen where she'd once explained her 6-year-old's room organizing system to us with total seriousness, where she'd studied for exams, where she'd once cried after a bad breakup, and Eleanor had made her tea while I sat there uselessly wanting to fix something I couldn't fix. I told her the French conversation at the dinner hadn't been entirely kind. She set her mug down. Kind about what? About our family. About you. A little. What did they say? I gave her the shape of it, not the exact words. That Colette hadn't imagined someone like her for Julian. That she and Marguerite had used the word ordinary. Sophie's face didn't do what I expected. I'd braced for hurt, and there was some of that. But mostly what came across her face was something closer to recognition, like a data point confirming a hypothesis she'd already quietly been forming. I wondered, she said. The way she is with me sometimes. Warm, then not quite. I told myself I was imagining it. You weren't. What did you do? I told her. The hallway, the French, the card. She was quiet for a moment, turning her mug slowly on the table. Then, you didn't do it at the table. No, why not? You could have. Because that dinner wasn't about me being right in front of an audience, I said. It was about you and Julian. I wasn't going to make your engagement dinner into something you'd have to explain to people for the next 30 years. She looked at me for a long moment. Dad, thank you for not making a scene. I didn't make a scene, I said. I made a statement. There's a difference. She almost smiled at that. Then, quieter. Do you think she'll actually change? Or just be more careful about when she says things? I didn't have a certain answer for her. I still don't think I fully do, even now. I don't know, I said honestly. Some people hear something like that and it changes them. Some people just get better at hiding it. I can't promise you which one Colette is. I can promise you that Julian loves you and that you don't need her approval to be exactly enough. Sophie nodded slowly. Then, after a pause, 3 peer-reviewed journals. Before 30, I said. That got the real smile out of her. The one that's been the best sound in any room since 1996. I won't pretend Colette Beaumont became a different woman overnight. People don't. If this story taught me anything, it's that real change is slow, uneven, and never fully finished. Not the clean, instant transformation I noticed it first at Christmas, small and easy to miss. Colette spent nearly 40 minutes with Sophie asking about her research, and for once it didn't feel like polite performance. She was actually listening, asking follow-up questions that meant she'd understood the last answer. I noticed it again at Easter, when she pulled Eleanor aside for a few minutes. I couldn't hear what was said, but Eleanor told me afterward. Colette had said, carefully, like she'd been working up to it, "Your husband was not what I expected. I mean that as a compliment. I wasn't generous in my first assessment. I'm trying to be more generous now." Eleanor had told her that generosity just needed complete information, and now she had more of it. Marguerite sent a card in November, a few lines, in French, apologizing for what she'd said, calling it unkind and inaccurate. I wrote back and told her Sophie and Julian were building something good, and that was what mattered now. I meant it. Colette never became warm the way Eleanor is warm, or effusive the way some people are. That was never going to happen, and honestly, I stopped needing it to. What I noticed instead was smaller and more durable. She started asking real questions. She stopped performing. The wedding was in June, at a garden venue outside Atlanta that Sophie and Julian picked entirely on their own, not Leon. Colette was involved the way a mother-in-law should be, consulted, included, never in charge, and she managed it with more grace than I'd expected 6 months earlier. The morning of the wedding, Sophie and I did what we've always done at the big moments of her life. A quiet walk, just the two of us, a tradition going back to her first day of kindergarten. We walked without talking for a while. Then she asked, "Are you happy today?" "I am," I said. "Even with everything? The Beaumonts? All of it? Everything is everything." The hard parts are usually what prove the good parts are real. She was quiet for a moment. "You could have made that dinner a lot louder, Dad. I know you could have." "Yes," I said. "Why didn't you?" I thought about my mother. 53 years of French, learned at her kitchen table, given to me not as a trick but as a form of protection I never expected to need this way. Because the things that matter at a table, I said, aren't the words people say when they think no one's listening. They're the people sitting across from you who deserve to know they're seen and defended by someone who's been paying attention the whole time. Sophie didn't say anything. She just put her arms around me, there in the June morning light. "On y va," she said quietly. "Let's go." In French. Her grandmother's French. Here's what I'd want you to take from this. If anything, everyone speaks 2 languages. The one they use when they know they're being heard, and the one they use when they think the room is private. The second one is usually the true one. You won't always get to understand it the way I did that night. But when you do catch it, when you hear what someone really thinks, said in a moment they thought was safe, you get to choose what you do with it. Loud isn't the only option. Sometimes precise, calm, and complete is the stronger move. It usually is, in my experience. My mother taught me that language should be saved for the things that actually matter. She was right about that, like she was right about most things. If that moment in the hallway, hearing him switch to French, watching Colette realize the room was never private, made you sit up a little, hit that like button. My mother from Leon deserves it. Tell me in the comments, have you ever understood something that wasn't meant for you? Been in a room where someone spoke about you, or someone you love, in a language they thought was private? What did you do with it? And before you go, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country below. I love seeing how far this reaches. If this story found you today, subscribe. There's a new one every week, about ordinary people who turned out to be anything, but about the things our parents teach us that end up saving us decades later. I'll be here, every week, in whatever language the moment requires.